Dr. Karanja, I'd like to ask you, Florida is now the largest school district in the country that has, in terms of school choice. In plain terms, what does school choice actually mean for Florida families?
So yes, it's true that Florida is at the forefront of school choice and really in the vanguard. A lot of other states are looking at Florida. What is Florida doing? And they're following suit. So if you are a family and you have school children and you have to decide where your kids are going to school, you have a variety of choices, right? You can choose to go in the public school, that's a choice. You can choose to go to a charter school, you can choose to go to a private school, or you can choose to homeschool. However, I think that what parents also need to know that there is a lack of transparency and a lack of access to data and a lack of access to independent researchers to truly examine how the school choice is going. So if I were a parent and I'm living in a zip code that is less affluent, I would be mindful, or I would want to know that, for example, Florida also has the highest charter school closure rate, right, at 40%, which is
there's a lot of different data sets that parents should be looking at when they're making these decisions.
And they're not readily available, because if you look at charter school closures in Florida, you wouldn't get that number. It took me, for example, 2 years to find out that there have been more than 400 schools closed.
And Jeff, the state is saying that nearly half of Florida students are involved in some form of school choice. So who's exactly using these programs?
Well, it's a variety of people, because I know, like in the introduction, you mentioned all those options, but you didn't mention magnet schools and some of the other things that people are choosing within their own school district, still in the public school system. So you go to IB, that's school choice. And so there's a lot of families that are taking advantage of that within the public school system, and they really like it. Then there are other families who, for whatever reasons, whether they're religious, personal, whatever, are choosing to homeschool, or they're choosing to use vouchers and go to private schools, or some of them have special needs for their children, and they use the vouchers to pay for the services in that way, and sometimes the public schools don't offer that. But what we're finding also is that when it comes to the vouchers, a lot of the people who are getting them are people who never were in the public school system to begin with. And so what happens then is when they say this money should follow the student, some money was never following any student, but they're still getting some.
Derek, in your reporting, you have investigated how districts respond when there are problems, right? There was a state audit last fall that found that Florida couldn't fully account for $270 million in scholarship money. When the money moves that fast, who's watching?
In general, what I've found when I'm reporting on these type of issues is that it's harder and harder to actually get the records. It's harder and harder to figure out where the money's gone. I know in Sarasota there was, I can't remember exactly how many voucher, the money did not follow the vouchers, but it seemingly, there's like a clearinghouse, and then there's, from my understanding, that it is a rather opaque, the money gets paid out, and then sometimes students would come back to school, to the school district. So like someone would start homeschooling, and then they would get the voucher money, and then they would go halfway through the year, they would then go back to the school district. And what effectively happened there was the school district would end up educating the student, and the voucher money had already been paid to somebody else.
Right. And we do want to point out that the state, even though they use the term unaccounted funds, they did not say that they found any evidence of theft or fraud. But the question remains of who's following the money.
Right, and then, but my understanding is that some of this voucher money has been spent on Disney World, on Lego sets, on other things you wouldn't typically associate with education. I mean, field trips, people go on field trips, but it typically was the parent paying to go to Disney World, not the taxpayer. So I do think it's harder and harder to figure out how education dollars are being spent when they're going directly to third parties, not the school district.
And Dr. Karanja, a Republican senator filed a bill, I'd like to ask you about that, to fix some of these problems, and it passed the Senate unanimously, but then it died in the Florida House. What does that tell us about where this debate sits?
Well, as I was saying previously, it doesn't surprise me because the trend has been towards expanding school choice, and if there is waste, or which there is, and if there is money that's being lost that can be found, and if there are students that don't necessarily continue in the same school, I think that Florida legislature is determined to continue in that direction. So I don't find it surprising. It's actually something that I see has been happening for the last 3 decades.